Okay, welcome everyone. We are delighted to have you join us for the 10th edition, the 10th version of our Sustainable Infrastructure, Putting Principles into Practice. I am Elizabeth Losses from Duke University, and we are delighted to have you all join us. As a quick note, if you have the chance to fix your name, to put either your affiliation or where you are joining us from right now, that would be great. And I'll do it on my name after I stop chatting. Before we begin, I want to mention a couple of rules, but also to acknowledge all of our partner institutions that are sponsoring this whole series, and a few rules of the road. First of all, this session is being recorded and you will receive a link of it later. Your attendance is consent to be recorded. Please do mute yourself. You will have a chance later in the session to talk, but for now, please mute. Rename yourself. As I just mentioned on your Zoom, there are 3 little buttons in the upper right where you can put your country or your affiliation. Throughout the event, the chat will be live. Feel free to put in any questions you have for the speakers, or if you need any technical assistance. We will be watching the chat closely, and we will have a chance for questions to our presenters during the session, but also at the very end, if you stay after the formal session is ended at 75 minutes, we'll have another 15 minutes of discussion. And we will also at the very end have a post-session survey. We really appreciate your input, so please do fill it out. Anyone who fills out this survey will automatically receive a certificate of attendance. And finally, there'll be a lot of links shared during this session. We will email you a link to the recording and to all of the links that are shared during the session. So with all that, we are going to start with just a practice polling question to get everyone going. In the chat right now, there is a link to the Mentimeter, and there are 2 questions we would like you to fill in. The first one is, give us 1 word that you would use to describe your profession. And then the second is, where are you in the world? And as we're waiting for those to come in, I will just mention that this series has 3 objectives. The first is to exchange state-of-the-art knowledge. And you can find the recordings, as well as we are slowly loading on case studies from each of these, and we'll have them all completed by the end of the series, which is in just 2 months. The second is to provide an interactive forum to learn not only from specialists, but from other practitioners. We recognize many of you on the session today have come together, and we hope that you're beginning to get acquainted with some of the other veterans of this series. And then finally, we want to connect you all more broadly with the sustainable infrastructure sphere through our LinkedIn group. And we have more plans for after the series ends in May to continue to build this community of practice. All right, so moving on, today we are on the 9th principle, which is transparent, inclusive, and participatory decision-making. This is going to be a really interesting session. I think for those of you who have been attending throughout have noticed that quite often the challenges or the lessons learned that have been mentioned, particularly in the various case studies, is that early and open participation by stakeholders and transparent, all-inclusive participation has been critical to the success of projects, or when it isn't available, it often creates a barrier. And so we're going to explore that really more deeply today, both in our technical presentation and also in the case study. But you'll notice, particularly in the case study, that there are also many of the other principles that we have talked about, like nature-based solutions and strategic planning. Many others will show up again in this case study. So I'm gonna let Joe Price from UNEP tell you more about it. But before I do that, Emily, why don't we take a look at the Mentimeter, and we'll look at who is here and where they're from. Okay, so once again, we have a lot of engineers. This is engineers are definitely the mainstay, but we also have folks from all sorts of other consultants, people interested in climate resilience, conservation, humanitarian help. So a nice broad group. And where are they from? Oh, we've got a group from Singapore this time, and the US is always well represented, but we have folks from Peru, which is good since our case presentation in Europe, Myanmar, all over the world. So anyway, thank you so much. We will have more Mentimeter questions, but for now, I want to hand this over to Joe Price from UNEP, who is going to tell us about our ninth principle. Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. So yes, the webinar today is about principle number 9, which is transparent, inclusive, and participatory decision-making. And as Elizabeth referred to, we've noticed that elements of this principle have come up in several other of the webinars so far, both in the Menti polls and the case presentations. So that suggested to us that stakeholder consultation is essential for the successful implementation of many aspects of sustainable infrastructure. And that's something that the principle states explicitly as well. So we'll hear more about this today as a distinct topic. So on the next slide then, the life cycle diagram. This principle should not be limited to one phase or just left until the detailed design phase, for example, of a project later on, but it should be included throughout the life cycle. Because in particular, early public participation is important so that stakeholders can influence key decisions about what infrastructure is delivered and where to deliver it. So on the next slide, just reading out then what this principle states explicitly, it says that infrastructure development should be underpinned by transparent planning, information sharing, and decision-making processes that facilitate meaningful, inclusive, and participatory stakeholder consultation. And in the case of indigenous peoples, their free, prior, and informed consent. National, subnational, and project-level grievance mechanisms should be available for addressing stakeholder complaints and concerns. So you can see that it's relevant to different administrative or working levels, as well as different phases in the life cycle. So on the next slide then, please, Emily. The first part of the principle is about stakeholder consultation specifically. First of all, it's important to note here that stakeholder consultation should begin with analysis to identify all potential users, but also non-user groups that may be affected by a given infrastructure development. And in the Peru case study presentation, we're going to hear more from the Smithsonian Institution about stakeholder mapping, among other aspects of consultation in the Peruvian Amazon. But especially important among these groups in the consultation process are women, people with disabilities, older people, youth, indigenous peoples, minorities, and other more vulnerable, marginalized, or disadvantaged groups. And so wide consultation with these different groups and actors can ensure that infrastructure meets local needs and preferences on the ground, and also that it's culturally appropriate, because that's important since infrastructure is often highly visible and leaves a large physical impression in communities for many decades. And as part of this, other actors like those from the private sector can also play an important role and bring relevant knowledge to the table during the consultation process. In general, though, ongoing stakeholder consultation throughout the life cycle is key for building trust for projects among local communities, and it can help reduce the likelihood of conflict related to infrastructure. A lack of transparency in consultation is found to be a major driver of local conflicts related to infrastructure. So that's obviously one clear benefit, but we'll hear more from the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative about other lessons around opening infrastructure up to multi-stakeholder dialogue, and also some practical resources for doing that. But on the next slide then, the next component of this principle is information sharing, and that's a critical element for effective consultation. And information to be shared can include, for example, development objectives by government officials, spatial planning data, environmental baseline data, different options that are being considered for investment for projects, results of assessments, justifications for decisions, and also procurement processes and costs as well. And as part of consultation, these types of information should be disclosed early enough so that infrastructure decisions can still be influenced and shaped by the inputs from the stakeholders in the consultation process. And finally, then on the last slide, please, this is about the issue of dispute resolution. So judicial and non-judicial mechanisms should be available and easily understandable for stakeholders so they can raise concerns or grievances regarding human rights abuses or negative environmental impacts related to an infrastructure project. Mechanisms, these mechanisms include, for example, operational level grievance mechanisms that may be established by businesses. And the mechanisms should use transparent processes that do not impede access to other remedies that might be available. So that's a short overview of Principle 9, and we'll hear more about the related technical and practical considerations from our next speaker. But before I introduce John Hawkins, our next speaker, I'd just like to introduce the Menti question then that we wanted to ask before we move on. So we'd like your opinion on what are the benefits of engaging stakeholders in project consultation. And we'd like you to pick your top two out of these following options. So the first is to include diverse perspective in project solutions. So that relates to the slide I was saying on stakeholder consultation, involving all these different groups in the process. To generate evidence, which is obviously important and useful. Raising issues through constructive dialogue, so that can help avoid conflict, obviously. Increase transparency and accountability. Or finally, credibility and independence for decision-making. So if you could please pick your top two for those, and then we'll take a look and see what's everyone's priorities. Just give you a moment or two for that. And obviously, there's other options you may have that we could discuss further in the breakout rooms too. We'll be keen to see which you hold up as being the most important there. So let's take a look. So we've got 22, the most for include diverse perspectives. Also a lot there on raise issues through constructive dialogue. 14 have said increase transparency and accountability, and then a little less for the other remaining two. So it looks like, yeah, the top two there, I think we can safely say, are including diverse perspectives and raising issues through constructive dialogue. Thank you all for that. So I'm going to now hand over then to our next speaker, our technical presenter. I'm very pleased to introduce to you John Hawkins, who is the Program Director at the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, COST, where he is responsible for strategic development and overseeing program delivery. This has included leading the development of COST tools and standards that are currently used in 19 countries and supporting their use in countries as diverse as Guatemala, Malawi, Thailand, Ukraine, and the UK. He also has over a decade of experience in researching and writing about the challenges of corruption and mismanagement in the sector, including for the Institution of Civil Engineers, the UK Department for International Development, London South Bank University, the World Bank, and most recently, Transparency International Australia. So John, thank you very much for speaking with us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me okay? Great, lots of nodding, good. I do apologise, I have an old-fashioned cold. You know, we almost forgot about them in lockdown, but courtesy of my son being at school, he's very good at spreading things at home. So if I start sneezing or anything or coughing, that's the reason, so I apologise in advance. Let me just share my screen, if that gets out of the way. So hopefully you can see that. So hopefully you can see the presentation. Thumbs up. Yep, good. I can see nodding. So yes, so thank you, Joseph, for the introduction. As Joseph said, I'm the Program Director at the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, better known as COST, which is a historical legacy when it was known as the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative. If you don't know, COST is a UK registered charity. It was spun out of what was then the Department for International Development in the UK about a decade ago. It has an independent set of trustees with participants from government, civil society, and the private sector. So it is multi-stakeholder at board level. And then I work for the International Secretariat and have a kind of global perspective. So what I'm going to be sharing with you are really 7 lessons that I've been thinking about in recent months, and particularly for a presentation I was doing for the UNODC in December, and I've kind of fine-tuned it for this to really think about multi-stakeholder work in particular. So we're a global partnership as well. We now actually have 20 COST members, with Dominican Republic just joining recently and launching their program just before Christmas. And really what we're able to do as a global partnership, we can share lessons, we can facilitate a dialogue, good best practice and ideas. A lot of our ideas are driven from the bottom up, from the partners we work with. And I think something that's unique is technology. We try to share, particularly on the open data side of things, on GitHub, the technology that's been developed. And we operate a membership system. So governments can join COST as a member and affiliate, but they have to commit to publishing data on their infrastructure investments right throughout the project cycle, and critically working with the private sector and civil society within a multi-stakeholder dialogue. So as I said, I have 7 lessons, and really this is the first one is in some ways the most critical and gives you kind of an overview of multi-stakeholder working within our context. When COST was conceived, the people considering it were looking at the successful launch of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, where they had a kind of multi-stakeholder framework and dialogue with the 3 stakeholder groups. So they were seeing how this might work within infrastructure. And over the years, we've really learned that you have to have clear rules of the game. If you're bringing together stakeholders that often had very adversarial relationships, and that includes industry with government as well as civil society, often feeling they have a difficult relationship with government. You need clear rules of the game, so you understand that when you're forming what we term a multi-stakeholder group, decisions can be made by consensus. The civil society feels its voice is going to be heard, along with, and is not going to be squeezed by what might be considered the kind of the power of government and the private sector. We talk about balanced participation. It doesn't necessarily mean equal, because that may not be necessarily possible. In Malawi, the government has the biggest membership, and it's because you have significant players like the Ministry of Finance, like the National Construction Industry Council, that is a very influential power state working with the Ministry of Public Works. You have the oversight authorities in public procurement, anti-corruption commission, and you want those voices because they have an interest in this. But then you have influential civil society organizations. So in Malawi, we have the Malawi Economic Justice Network, Human Rights Commission as well. So you've got really the critical players around the table that can provide that oversight and that leadership. And when we started talking to the government in Honduras 7 or 8 years ago now, 2014, I first started talking to Alfredo Quintero, pictured here. And it was a period of political turmoil. There'd been the kind of a strange, coup in about 2010, where an elected government had been removed, and there was a lot of disputes about it all. And he said, we need, we'd reached ground zero, and we need reformers like him and others wanted to work with international organizations like EITI, like the Open Government Process and COST, to see if we can rebuild trust for civil society. And we often work with a lot of governments where there's a lot of problems. And this government of Honduras, as you may have heard, with Orlando Hernandez, the now former president under arrest, there were a lot of problems and a lot of allegations around corruption and in infrastructure. But we find there are reformers who can provide that leadership and do stuff that opens up public infrastructure in a fairly successful way, as we'll show you. And what we've been able to do really with a kind of this multi-stakeholder approach, we find that you can, by having government listening to civil society and the private sector, making decisions by consensus, we can lead and influence to really enable transparency. And we've really found that technology has been critical for this, to be able to get data published at scale at each stage of the project cycle. So at cost at an international level, and you'll see at the bottom of the slide there, we publish a standard with our partners at the Open Contracting Partnership called the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard. And there's a hyperlink to a toolkit there that you can look at. And what that standard does is define what should be disclosed and how it should be disclosed. So is it a date? Is it a financial figure? Is it a pull down menu? Is it free text? So really, then by doing that, you can really disclose data at scale on open data platforms and use it at scale. So you can see in Honduras, we disclosed data on over $4 billion of investments, and it's been including PPPs. And despite political challenges, one of the things Alfredo said, despite the problems they've had on PPPs, they kept making the information public. They kept making, the information kept coming out. And then that technology, and the platform's known as CSOX, which is a Spanish acronym, is on our GitHub platform. But then using it is critical. And what we've found, and we're trying to protect this data at the moment in Ukraine, as you can imagine, working with the Roads Agency with and the Ministry of Infrastructure. In 2020 alone, they published data around $3.6 billion. And it's analyzed in real time. So they have a series of dashboards where civil society, private sector, but also government can see what the average price per kilometre of road is across the sector. They can see where the investment is going across the country. There's a map that says which regions are benefiting from the investment, which firms are winning the work, but also which firms are performing well and which government entities perform well or not so well. And there's kind of red flags around that. And we have guidance around how that process of making that information public is best achieved as well, which is hyperlinked. The third lesson really is around the credibility that multi-stakeholder sites can give. So it's in the black bold text, we have something called the cost assurance process that independent experts, civil engineers, QSs, quantity surveyors, architects, look at the data and turn that into compelling information, highlighting key messages that are really pertinent for the public, that is really going to stand out to them. But one of the things that you can do both locally but also internationally is really draw that information together, see where those issues arise and see them as kind of risks. And we can see where those risks fall within the project cycle and give us that kind of critical evidence. Because I know in a month's time we talk about the importance of evidence. We find that the reformers in government, the ministers who want to do the right thing, often know what's going on, but need evidence to be able to do the right thing. So we had Yami Yari, who is very safe in Germany. He was the ambassador when for Afghanistan, where the Taliban took control. But when we were working with him, he was the Minister of Public Works. And the evidence from the first report he used to set up a new design unit, where they reviewed design of 2 or 3 dozen projects, and they could find savings of over $8 million. And we have numerous other stories you can see on our website around how the evidence from the assurance process has been used to make positive changes to individual projects and broader sector reforms. The fourth lesson really is around the points of training, how we've really been able to, multi-stakeholder groups have been able to train journalists and communities to use the information that's been made public, but also governments to make sure they're disclosing good data, because without good data, then it makes the challenge much greater. So you can see examples of how that's what we've been able to do during the COVID. So in Honduras, they actually tracked and encouraged journalists to look at investments in emergency health facilities, how that was being, how were contracts being awarded. But then critically, if you're training, they've been using existing in many countries, not just Honduras, but in Malawi, in Uganda, we use what's already happening within the local political economy. You've got to kind of use what's there and build upon it and stretch the space, build that capacity so citizens can actually monitor infrastructure projects. And what we did here is they also use then feedback loops. So they're using WhatsApp to say, this is what we're spotting. They spotted some illegal burning of asphalt on one particular road. That goes to the multi-stakeholder group, can then talk to the Ministry of Infrastructure to make sure action is taken. The fifth lesson is really around, and this has been very much driven bottom up by the countries, is finding the right mechanism to engage citizens directly, to inform about what cost programs in countries have found out, but also ask them, what issues are you finding? And it was great to see constructive dialogue being kind of, you're seeing as a kind of a key, the second kind of most important area coming out from greater transparency in the sector and engaging stakeholders. We're certainly finding it's really been interesting, kind of sometimes experiment to see how having officials talking to local communities can build that trust, kind of break that trust, create that trust deficit, overcome that trust deficit that's been created in recent times. And we found it's been fascinating us to think that community meetings in very different contexts at times in Uganda raise very, very similar issues around, and I think it's very interesting that issues around flood risks keep coming up because of extreme weather in many countries. And then the authorities seem to respond very positively to that dialogue and institute change. The sixth lesson is really around the business and private sector. Often there's very adversarial relationships, and we find a multi-stakeholder dialogue. You can convene business with government. You can get business, particularly in countries in Africa who feel firms feel they're being really excluded from the markets. They can't compete with the Chinese and other foreign players. And they want to understand, they don't often know the procurement system, how it operates. So having that dialogue, maybe having a few policy changes as we saw in Uganda, can lead to firms feeling more able to bid for work. And we've got a great case study on our website about Uganda you can look at, and we want to see if we could do more around this area, because it's certainly something it's a bit untapped, and I think there's other countries that benefit from this. Finally, it really just trying to draw things together around the importance of multi-stakeholder dialogue and the multi-stakeholder group approach that we have with cost member programs that really drive cost programs. And it's almost public policy theory. So we have what I call outsider relationships. So really engaging the media to really almost to create an advocacy platform to talk about the issues that are being found within the sector. Some of the outrageous kind of cost and time increases on the average project that we've seen, as you can see here on this particular road. And this is one of the first kind of impacts we got probably 8 years ago or so, 7 or 8 years ago. And we've really started thinking about, oh, how did this happen? What's the process? I mean, it's very linear, and lots of change isn't linear, but this was quite an easy one to communicate in terms of how did change occur. So you have that kind of outsider engagement with the media, building capacity of journalists, of giving awards to journalists who wrote about the issues. But then the lady you can see in the second picture is Linda Peary. She was at that time the chief executive of the National Construction Industry Council, and a real political survivor, working with many different ministers of public works of different colors, political colors. And she talked to the minister and said, look, we've got to do something about this. Here's the evidence. We're not saying corruption is going on, although it probably was, but something's going on and it's unsustainable. So the minister cancelled the contract and the project was rethought. So I think new contracts with much, were then relet later on. So this final slide, which you'll be able to look at your leisure, is just a summary of those lessons. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, John. That was very informative and great to have the lessons so clearly summarized. My name is Emily Corwin. I'm the Director of Nature-Based Engineering Solutions at Conservation International. And please think of your questions for John. And while you're doing that, or if you want to put them in the chat, we'd love to invite you back to the Mentimeter to answer 2 questions. In the previous Mentimeter question, we asked about what some of the benefits are to stakeholder consultations, but we recognize that there are challenges. So would like to hear from you what you see as the top 2 challenges for stakeholder consultation in this list. About time intensive, requires balanced representation, must incentivize stakeholders to participate, is hard to facilitate well, and can be expensive. And there's a second question in this set about when stakeholder consultation can have the greatest impact in a project life cycle. Is it in setting policy, strategic and conceptual planning, design, construction, operations and maintenance, or monitoring? So welcome you to raise your hand and come off mute if you have a question for John, and if not, I have one I would love to ask him. Great. So I'm curious, John, and this is actually to one of the questions here about the challenges related to stakeholder consultation, and that's around incentivizing stakeholders to participate. It seems like many of your lessons touch on the importance of having a multi-stakeholder group and inclusive and diverse. How do you establish and maintain and kind of incentivize the participation throughout a project of that multi-stakeholder group?
It's a good question, and it is very much, I mean, we've had failures. Tanzania, it was failed basically because of really issues around the multi-stakeholder group and some lack of government will. And we have struggled sometimes with Malawi being a case in point. We've really struggled with private sector participation because they felt that it's a risk being involved in transparency and accountability. And it certainly was during, some of you may be aware of the Cashgate scandal of 8 years ago. You didn't really want to be seen as an anti-corruption campaign at that time. So, I mean, for the multi-stakeholder group, I think it is very much a strategic position. It's longer term, and we're trying to institute things into government systems. So really having that, you're trying to identify the right strategic partners, I think, and who are viewed as having legitimacy in a kind of consultative way. So I think that is really that kind of very important. I think for the civil society to be part of this, they really need to see that government is a committed partner, because if they don't see government being a political partner, then it's much more difficult. And I remember when we first started working in Thailand, there was some part of the private sector saying, no, we're not going to work here. We've been through all this before, and really they're not, whichever, when it was a democratic government and now the military type government, they said whatever happens, they're not really that committed. But to our surprise, there has been quite a lot of success there. So yes, I think for those kind of strategic business partners, kind of more business associations and the civil society, that kind of knowing government is committed and wants to do this really is important. Yeah.
And if I can, just a quick follow on there is one of the things we've been hearing more about is actually compensating stakeholders for their time and their ongoing participation in a project. Have you been a part of that, seen that done well? And this is just for everyone as a teaser for the breakout rooms. We want to hear your experiences also, everyone's experiences with this or input on this particular thing. But John, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, where do I start? Yeah, we've had problems with per diems, big,
Okay.
I mean, that has been a real issue in one or two places. And we're going to be publishing a new set of values and code of conduct, I hope, fairly soon. We wanted to do it earlier, but we realized that we were trying to replace principles with values and realized we needed both. Anyway, it is particularly for them. I mean, there are obviously issues at community level and trying to think how they might participate, but this is really at the more strategic MSG level where, you know, in many countries there is this culture of allowances, and yeah, and it's been a real difficult issue. So, and I think one of the things we learned from a couple of and it led to doing governance reviews, and what we've learned is that one of the things that really struck home with me is that if you're bringing in people from a business background, and civil society and government, they come with baggage is the wrong word, but they come with a certain values and culture from those sectors. So then trying to agree, you kind of then need a process to agree, well, how do you agree a mutual set of values and code of conduct? So that's something we've been looking to resolve, because we've had a couple of interesting experiences in the last 2 or 3 years that certainly in Tanzania led to part of the reason the program was closed.
Great. Well, thank you. And before we hear from our next speakers and the Mentimeter results, thank you again, John, for sharing your presentation, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation in breakout groups. And let's hear from you all. So here's the stakeholder consultation can be challenging, and it looks like the top 2 that folks picked were because it requires balanced representation of stakeholders, and that question about, or issue, about incentivizing stakeholders to participate. So thanks to the 40 respondents who had inputs there. And then the second question, so these were set up on a slider, so you can say which part of the phase of a project is stakeholder engagement least impactful or have the potential to have the highest impact. So of all of the kind of project phases, it looks like the 3 where respondents thought stakeholders could have the greatest impact were in setting policy, strategic and conceptual planning, and during project design. But I love it. Look, in monitoring, it comes back again, and kind of thinking about some of the citizen science and oversight that happens, can happen after project implementation. So thanks to everyone who responded to that. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speakers. And we have 2 representatives for this case study. The first is Maria Sanchez Cuervo. She is a conservation biologist at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute's Center for Conservation and Sustainability. She's the managing director of CCS's Paraguay programs and co-leads the In Situ, Ex Situ Conservation Program and the Sustainable Productive Landscape Initiative. And then our second participant, who will be the main presenter for the case study, is Jessica Deichmann. And Jessica conducts research at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute to address questions of species and ecosystem resilience in the face of anthropogenic change. Working closely with partners from a variety of sectors, she aims to identify key environmental and climate challenges created by sustainable infrastructure development and industrial operations in high biodiversity areas. So Jessica is going to be the main presenter, but both Jessica and Ana Maria will be available for questions and in our breakout groups. So with that, Jessica, I'll pass it to you and I'll advance the slides on my side.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Emily. And hi, everyone. As Emily mentioned, Ana Maria and I are researchers at the Smithsonian Institution Center for Conservation and Sustainability. And our group at the Smithsonian specifically focuses on the integration of biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, these needs with sustainable infrastructure development priorities. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today on behalf of our team at the Smithsonian about this case study on participatory scenario planning in Peru. So let's jump right in. Next slide, please. Madre de Dios, Peru is a region in the southeastern part of the country, and it borders Brazil and Bolivia. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography, we have an inset map here and a beautiful map showing Madre de Dios's location. Madre de Dios is rich in biodiversity and in cultures, and it forms an integral part of a key conservation corridor, which can be seen in yellow on this map, that connects more than 30 million hectares of land between some of the most important protected areas, shown in green here, of the tropical Andes hotspot, shown in red. Prior to 2010, the paving of a major road known as the Interoceanic Highway began. This road is an essential economic corridor that first crossed the Andes Mountains to connect Madre de Dios and the rainforest with the Pacific coast. And it was later completed to connect all the way to Sao Paulo in Brazil. On the one hand, the Interoceanic Highway has promoted multiple economic activities like tourism and the production of Brazil nuts and cacao, but it has also promoted deforestation and fragmentation through increased agriculture, cattle ranching, logging, and perhaps most devastatingly, a really large expansion of illegal gold mining that's contributed to the loss of more than 50,000 hectares of forest and wide-scale pollution in rivers. Next slide. So for Madre de Dios, the concept of sustainable landscapes is key to maintaining natural resources, but also promoting economic growth. Emily, could you click? I think I have an animation here. There we go. So this concept of sustainable landscapes is one that will be familiar to many of you as it was covered last year in the Principle 4 presentations. But in summary, sustainable landscapes are composed of green infrastructure or natural systems that include forests, floodplains, wetlands, et cetera, that provide ecosystem services to people like flood protection and climate regulation. And they're also composed of gray infrastructure, which is that human engineered piece of the landscape, like roads, dams, farms that provide economic services. So when green and gray infrastructures are well integrated, a landscape can achieve sustainable development. Next slide. To be able to plan for sustainable landscapes, we can use predictive tools like participatory scenario planning. That's a tongue twister. Try to say it 3 times fast. Participatory scenario planning allows us to integrate the future green and gray infrastructure as well as social dimensions. So scenario planning explores different future states that we call scenarios. And these scenarios are represented here by yellow circles. And these are potential ways in which the future might unfold. We can model the outcomes of each of these scenarios using data on present and recent conditions from the past, and extrapolating those conditions to the future, as we can see in this diagram. Now, each of these yellow dots are different options for the future, but some of them are more realistic than others. We can define a preferable future scenario, seen here in green. Then we can compare that preferred scenario with other possible scenarios to understand how the decisions that we make today might potentially affect the future. Participatory scenario planning integrates stakeholder input into co-developing those scenarios and can inform long-term strategic planning for infrastructure at the landscape scale. Next slide. So in 2014, we were approached by Hunt Oil Exploration and Production Company of Peru to develop a biodiversity action plan for a natural gas infrastructure project they were starting in Madre de Dios. Together, our teams discussed the need for understanding that infrastructure project in the broader regional context. So among other activities, our Smithsonian team initiated a participatory scenario planning assessment in Madre de Dios to evaluate the outcomes of different development trajectories based on qualitative and quantitative data. And the main aim of this participatory scenario planning project was to feed directly into strategic planning and inform the enabling environment throughout the process through a co-development approach that incorporated the priorities of representative stakeholders and also those contrasting stakeholder visions of development in the region. The project was funded by the oil and gas sector with the initial intention of understanding changes in the landscape driven by other sectors like illegal gold mining and agriculture to inform where to integrate gas infrastructures in the landscape to promote larger sustainable development. But the project was also intended to encourage the regional government to plan for sustainable infrastructure by helping them be able to see the consequences of different scenarios of what the landscape could look like in the year 2040. Next slide. This is the general framework that our Smithsonian team developed for participatory scenario planning in Madre de Dios, and it includes 7 steps from an initial assessment of ecosystem services all the way through the communication of results. And stakeholder consultation plays a major role, particularly in steps 1, 2, 6, and 7. I'll go back to those later. And this approach goes beyond business as usual, meaning that it goes beyond the environmental and social impacts of infrastructure at the project level to consider all the synergies and interdependencies between the different infrastructure systems and sectors in the landscape and their cumulative impacts on people and the environment. This analysis really provides a holistic view of Madre de Dios's future that can contribute to maintaining the functionality of a large-scale biodiversity conservation corridor while also providing for economic sustainability. And this approach offers decision makers a forward-looking sustainable development vision that can be replicated in other regions. Next. So in order to carry out a comprehensive stakeholder engagement and analysis process, the first step is to select stakeholders. So we worked with local partner to identify an initial list of about 200 actors that were representative of a broad spectrum of multi-stakeholder groups, including government, NGOs, producers, private sector, et cetera. And each stakeholder in the initial list was assessed by our local partners using the matrix approach to stakeholder mapping that you can see here. Here, influence refers to the ability of a stakeholder to make change with respect to the problem addressed by the project. And interest refers to the degree to which a stakeholder is directly affected by or dependent on the project. In general, stakeholders with more influence and more interest, shown in quadrant 2 here, are key, as are stakeholders with less influence and more interest because they possess this integral local knowledge. For this project, the stakeholder mapping narrowed the initial group from 200 to 51 stakeholders. Next. So after the stakeholder selection, the first step in the framework was to assess ecosystem services. Next. We invited all 51 stakeholders identified through mapping for interviews and workshops in May 2015. 25 people from 13 groups accepted for this initial consultation. And during this process, during these workshops, we asked stakeholders about their perceptions of the importance of ecosystem services and their current and future state, thinking about a 10 to 15 year time frame. And we also asked stakeholders to identify the main drivers of change affecting these ecosystem services. Next. Now, as a result of this first round of consultations, we identified main drivers of change and priority ecosystem services. But in order to balance the representativeness, something that John mentioned, of each stakeholder group equally, which is really necessary to ensure a neutral stakeholder consultation process, we used a weighted system to prioritize the information that we were going to incorporate in these first qualitative scenarios. So based on the weighted stakeholder values, we developed 8 potential future landscape scenarios for the Madre de Dios region. Next. This table has a lot of information. Please just focus on the 8 potential future scenarios across the top. These are qualitative scenarios. And then we have drivers of change on the first column on the left. To validate these scenarios and to select the 4 most interesting and relevant to stakeholders, we held a second round of consultations in June of 2015. And this was the first opportunity that stakeholders had to discuss all these scenarios. We asked participants to collectively assess these 8 scenarios in terms of their degree of impact, low, medium, and high, and the probability that they would occur, possible, probable, or very likely. Then we asked the participants to collectively select and rank the 4 scenarios out of the 8 that they wanted to be considered for this project. Click, Emily, please. Thanks. These are the weighted rankings. So interestingly, while the purpose of this project initially was to help identify where future natural gas infrastructure could be integrated into the landscape to promote sustainable development, the increased gas development scenario was not actually prioritized by stakeholders. You see it way down in the list. Next slide. The top 3 priority scenarios for the local stakeholders included unplanned gold mining, land planning, and landscape conservation. And we also included the current trends scenario, business as usual, because it's really considered to be the baseline to which any other scenario could be compared. The main hypotheses of these 4 final scenarios were refined, and we took them into the modeling process. Next slide. So here I'm highlighting steps 3, 4, and 5 of the framework, which is where the first rounds of stakeholder consultation meet the quantitative analysis.
Jessica froze for me, for others also. Yeah.
So we compile data. Hear me?
Yes. I think you're back. If you
Great.
Yep.
Great. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
I might try, and that might help.
Great.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Sounds good.
Great. Should I start at the beginning of this slide?
We heard this is really where the quantitative factors started to come into play.
Perfect. Okay. So in number 3, we compiled the data and we used that to evaluate past land use changes to convert the scenario narratives that we developed with stakeholders into these quantitative geospatial models of landscape change to predict future land cover changes in the region to the year 2040 under the specific hypotheses that we developed for each scenario. And then we evaluated the success of the scenarios in achieving sustainable development using 15 quantitative indicators. More details on these technical aspects can be found in the final report, which will be shared with everybody at the end of the presentation. Next slide. In this 3rd round of consultations that were held in Madre de Dios and in the Peruvian capital, Lima, in March 2017, we presented the results and discussed recommendations for implementation. Next slide. So in these meetings, we communicated the 4 quantitative models, and stakeholders were able to visualize for the first time the potential outcomes based on current knowledge of the development scenarios for the landscape in 2040. For example, if we look at unplanned gold mining scenario in the bottom left here, it's quite easy to visualize the expansion resulting in forest loss along these rivers. And this panorama can be easily contrasted with other scenarios like that in the blue there, land use planning, where environmental degradation outcome is clearly reduced. We also had the objectives of discussing the recommendations to promote sustainable infrastructure and landscape management in the region. So this was our final round of communications. Next slide. And while the project results were shared broadly with government and other decision makers, we had some challenges, particularly high turnover in leadership and particularly in government positions, as well as disruptions due to COVID have interfered with implementation. However, there have been some recent advancements in private sector projects that are using this tool to guide sustainable development initiatives in Madre de Dios. So that's promising. Next and last slide. So as part of this process, we identified some actions that could contribute to improving the stakeholder engagement process for scenario planning that we think are widely applicable to other types of stakeholder engagement for strategic planning approaches. The first is, if you are not an expert in facilitation or communication, you should engage one to lead messaging from the start, to minimize misunderstandings or creation of expectations about something that's not intended to be accomplished as a direct result of the project. Second, engage local partners from the outset that have detailed knowledge about potential stakeholders. They can really help you identify the most relevant stakeholders for inclusion to ensure diverse perspectives and balanced participation from the very beginning of the process. And then finally, once you engage with stakeholders for strategic planning on an infrastructure project, there will inevitably be expectations regarding the outcomes of that engagement. And for this reason, it's important to think a step ahead towards implementation. If just a single company is involved in the implementation of an infrastructure project, then things are really simple, but that is rarely the case. More often than not, it will be necessary to coordinate with multiple actors to implement the co-design strategy. So understanding the intricacies ahead of planning can really help facilitate timely and effective implementation. Next slide. And there, that is all. And I'm sorry for the technical difficulties.
Thank you. Thank both of you so much. That was really fascinating. I have 100 questions now, but we are short on time. I noticed there was a question from someone raised their hand. I don't think it's up right now, but if someone has a question and wants to unmute themselves. Okay, while we're waiting, let me ask. So one of the things I noticed from your lessons learned about clear messaging and good facilitation is the importance of knowing where you want to go and having a facilitator help you not get off track. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the participation representing the illegal gold miners, the small-scale gold miners. How did you decide how to include them and how to rank them, given that given their intentions?
Oh, Liz, that's a good question, but I think I'm going to have to pass that one off to Ana Maria.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, well, yeah, the gold mining sector was invited, and obviously that was kind of a big deal, you know, talking among all the other stakeholders, because obviously they have their own perspectives. But to resolve some problems, some of the initial problems, we had to do like different sessions, you know, some interviews separate and other workshops separate to avoid confrontation. So that was one of the things that we had to do. But also regarding how we analyze the data or the representativeness of every stakeholder, they were treated, you know, the gold mining sector, they were treated equally with the other stakeholders. But we did the whole analysis. We used the mapping analysis, the social network analysis, and also the group relation analysis to balance the representation of everybody. But yeah, at the beginning was kind of difficult to, you know, to engage them and sit everybody in the same room. So that's why we had interviews and separate interviews and workshops with other sectors.
Great, thank you, Ana Maria. We are tight on time, so we're not going to take any more questions right now. We will come back afterwards for 15 minutes at the end for anybody who wants to discuss or delve into this or the technical presentation more. We're going to go into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes or so. I want to remind everyone that we have a post-session survey. Please do fill this in before you leave. The link is in the chat, and you'll get a certificate of attendance if you fill it out. So the breakout questions following on these two interesting discussions are: how do you ensure diversity and balance of stakeholders that represent project beneficiaries? That really follows on that gold miner question there. And then the second question is, how do you incentivize stakeholders or citizens for their engagement in the consultation process? Should they be compensated for their participation? We started to talk about that earlier with John. So please bring your own thoughts and experiences, and we will go to breakouts for approximately 10 minutes.
Great. Welcome back, everyone. That was just enough time to scratch the surface, or barely scratch the surface on these really important issues. So just in our last 2 minutes here of our scheduled time together, I want to share some of the reflections that we captured within the breakout groups. So the first question, how do you ensure the diversity and balance of stakeholders represent project beneficiaries? An open process, public participation. Oh, this isn't applying the principles of the Aarhus Convention. I'm not familiar with that. I'll have to look that up. Advertise meetings, meet where communities are, meet at times that work for them. And then the last thing our group touched on also was around kind of a charismatic or facilitator who represents culturally or the diversity of the stakeholders who you're working to bring into the process. And then on the second question here, incentivizing stakeholders, should they be compensated? Our group, just from my experience, recognize that there are a lot of potential problems with paying stakeholders for their time. People can be involved for the wrong reason, but maybe our group kind of felt that around transportation particularly, that was needed to bring people to a consultation if needed. So just to quickly close us out, I want to announce and remind folks to join us next month. This will be in April 13th, on our last principle number 10, evidence-based decision-making. And very happy to have Savina Carlucci from the Resilience Shift. She'll be doing our technical presentation about the sustainable infrastructure pathway. And we're still finalizing our case presentation, but particularly looking to highlight an example of where data has been collected from a project and there's been a feedback loop to inform the process and the design for how that happens. So that is evidence-based decision-making. So hope you can join us for that. Just as a couple of reminders, please fill out the post survey. And once you do, you'll receive a certificate of completion. Welcome you to join our group on LinkedIn. And please stay for the next 15 minutes or so. We'll have just informal conversation with our speakers and other members here in the community to continue the conversation. So thank you so much for joining, and thanks for your time. And Liz, please chime in if I missed anything.
It's great. Thank you. Thank you to our three wonderful presenters. And I hope folks who have more comments and questions will stay on for the informal part of this session, the next 15 minutes. So great. All right. I will just start with a question, and then please, if folks have either raise your hand or put something in the chat, and so that we can pull other people in. But we had an interesting conversation. I don't know if Hillman is, I see Hillman is still there, about whether if the facilitator has a particular outcome that they're trying to push the group for, how that influences the consultation process. And I'm wondering, first of all, John, is this something that you all think about in your multi-stakeholder groups, the role of facilitation and how that can affect the outcome? And then also Ana Maria or Jessica.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because we're looking at a strategic multi-stakeholder group, so yes, we've often done the facilitation ourselves to try, and particularly where there's some disagreements within the multi-stakeholder group itself, and try to ask them, really, you're trying to understand the dynamics and why there are disagreements, to try and get to, you know, a happy to a point where everyone's happy. But yes, you're right. Yeah, you have to have the right person who understands those dynamics. I remember when we first started in that working in Afghanistan, we made sure that we had someone who knew Afghanistan, knew the different ethnic groups, and understand the dynamics between those groups, was there and observing and offering advice. I wasn't there, a colleague of mine was there, and we were very careful about that, because, you know, there is often tension between Pashtuns and other groups. So yeah, that was very, very important. So and then at community level, again, once you're at that level, yeah, it is important to have a trusted, I think someone who's trusted by the communities, to make sure that people feel they're going to be able to speak as well. I think just very, very quickly, one of the things that's really important with those community meetings is the way you invite people, the way you publicize it is very, very important, because people don't have necessarily, or they all have phones and data and stuff like that, so which makes life easier. But we found, like, things like radio, people have radios, so communicating on radios, and loudspeakers on backs of lorries backs of trucks going through little villages and things like that, so people are aware of what's going on is really, really important. So how you advertise that these meetings are taking place is to really make sure, particularly women who are often very busy, are aware of things and feel like they can participate.
Yeah, I would just add to what John said, and I hope my internet connection is stable. Otherwise, I will turn off my video. No? Okay, now it's better. Sorry. Ana Maria left because her internet connection is also unstable. But I will just add to what John said. You know, I think it's, on the one hand, it's our responsibility to be neutral facilitators. And in the case study I presented today, we made a real concerted effort to ensure that all the scenarios were presented in the same way. And given that our project was funded by the hydrocarbon sector, and that scenario was not prioritized by stakeholders, I think we may have done a good job. Like, that was kind of a sign that we tried to avoid bias, and I think we did, but avoiding bias completely is impossible. So finding those dynamic facilitators with lots of experience is important, but then they also have innate biases because of their experiences in the community. So it's all a bit of a balancing act. And of course, we talk about clear messaging. Well, our clear messaging, in a way, has a bias, because we're, you're trying to message something or you're trying to get something done. So it's a constant struggle. And I think maybe just being aware of that as an issue throughout any project and doing your best to make it balanced and making sure that you have participation from stakeholders with different perspectives is really key.
Thank you. Chris, I'm wondering if you put something in the chat and you followed up on Emily's comment about the Aarhus Convention. I'm wondering if you could just give a couple sentences on that and then go ahead and throw out your question.
So hopefully you can hear me because I've had mic issues this week.
Yep.
I was not familiar with Aarhus as well, but I looked it up and it does look like it's a convention that helps give some guidelines for public engagement. So I thought that was just useful for the group, for whoever put that comment out there.
Thank you.
And then my question is really, because I have been part of many facilitation efforts, but it's sometimes more challenging when you've got outsiders coming into a local community. I'm wondering if anybody's worked with mediators in addition to the facilitators, recognizing that there's already folks that might have some conflict, and kind of to have small groups and work through things so you can make some progress, right? Just curious if that's been beneficial or a negative. Thank you.
Does anybody have any experience bringing in mediators? It certainly sounds like with the Peru case, you all had a pretty hot situation with the gold miners. Did you think about bringing in mediators?
Sorry.
No. Go ahead.
Jump in. So we had a community that was, sort of really did not trust the government, and even though we were a nonprofit, doing the facilitation, but we were also very much, steeped in our perspective and view to get to a more nature-friendly solution. But I think maybe it was a combination of mistrust of any outsider or something else, but things sort of fell apart at a point, and that's when we got mediators. I think if we had maybe engaged experienced facilitators, it maybe could have been avoided. I don't know, but yeah, the mediation kind of did help sort of iron out those wrinkles, and then we could have a much better conversation with the mediator present. But yeah, to me, it is definitely something that you should have in your back pocket as an option to go to if things don't go in the right vein. But I wouldn't say you start with a mediator. I think starting with an experienced facilitator is much better.
Yeah, I was, that's a really interesting experience. And I was just going to say that I don't think we got to the point of really considering mediators. We did our best to act as mediators, even though we were not trained in that, by simply separating groups out and talking with them in different rooms and different stakeholder meetings. And I don't want to blame all things on finance, but I will just point out that at least in our experience, adding people to the team costs more money. And so we typically only have a certain budget for a project. And when we get to the point where we realize we need a mediator, then where do we take from our budget to spend on mediation? And it's just an unfortunate reality. So if that could be considered as part of best practice and then we think about it from the beginning and we build it into a budget, that I think maybe that's where we need to get in our frame of mind.
Great. Very practical.
I want to tell something. Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Actually, in the infrastructure sector, what we are doing before we have to tender for new project, we have do a preliminary survey with the community for environmental, health, and safety. So for these purposes, whatever you require, the person who is very much aware about that discipline, we have to put them as a facilitator. There is no required for mediator. But before we are doing this thing in the infrastructure sector, but because of this COP26, we have to more concentrate, because we are doing, but it is not implementing. That because it is not implementing in the project. It is not the society is not benefited. So this thing will be, we have to come through the government and the private sector to concentrate more about this, getting this raw data from the community, for the environmental, for the health, for the safety. Then I think it is not a very tough job. So this is my during pre-feasibility study we can do it. It is the part of the project.
Great, great. Any other add-ons? Okay, we are almost out of time. Don't forget to fill in the post-survey. I have one final question that I've been dying to know from Jessica. The consultation process was funded by the oil company, but they didn't ask for it. It wasn't part of what they originally funded you all for. How did they respond when you finished?
Mainly whatever thing is going on, how much budget client is allocated for this consultancy, for this report, for geotechnical, for environmental, for design related. If the client
I think, Biplab, if you want to come back on, you're muted. But I'll try to answer Liz's question.
So what I'm thinking, the client will, they will allocated reasonable budget for this pre-investigation of feasibility study for with the environment, with the social or the economy, whatever may be. Then the consultant will definitely do the survey properly, because small money, so small survey will do. Sometimes people will not go to site, they will manipulate the data.
Thank you, Biplab. I think we are hoping to have Jessica answer the question. So sorry to interrupt because we are almost out of time, if you don't mind. Jessica, I think you can go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks. So the company, they actually,
why Pallavi?
they were actually really happy with the outcome. You know, I think what was a little bit refreshing and has been something we've experienced in our collaborations with most companies that we've worked with is that they kind of gave us the license to develop the project as we saw fit from our, technical expertise. So we did produce a separate report for them that was more directed at the gas infrastructure and where to integrate that in the landscape based on the results. But then the broader report was more of this broader view about sort of policy and integrated landscape management and planning that was for all stakeholders. So in the end, they let us proceed and use the techniques we thought were most appropriate, and everyone seemed to be pretty happy with the outcome.
Great. Well, it is time. Thank you so much. And for those of you interested in learning more, we will send out the links. They're also in the chat to all of this information. And please join us again next month for the 10th and final principle on evidence-based planning, decision-making, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank
Anna
you.
Maria.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.